Hello, everyone. My name is Thorben Wieditz. I'm a researcher and campaigner, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Uber and how Uber spreads the kind of misclassification of worker models around the world we've been hearing about. But this is more like a concrete example of what people are doing in Toronto to push back against Uber's attempt to exploit workers at no end and, roll over city governments and other levels of governments to institute regulatory regimes that really or entrenches them as a monopoly player in the transportation sector and in other sectors, thinking about delivery work. Let me just quickly begin by sort of explaining a little bit about what this project was about and how it came to be. We did some work earlier in Toronto on regulating another platform called Airbnb, and that was a union-led initiative headed up by the Hotel Workers Union in Toronto because they realized that there were condominium buildings right across from their unionized hotel properties that had 300 short-term rentals in them that essentially competed with unionized workers across the street. And something had to be done about it. So Airbnb, as people probably know, is a company that uses residential housing stock as hotel inventory. And we figured out, through a coalition effort that was union-led, how to regulate this company in Toronto, and then after that in Ottawa and in Vancouver and in BC provincially now. And the federal government has done also some regulatory moves to rein this company in. But while we were doing this, we realized, hey, wait a minute, in Toronto, regulators seem to be open to regulating Airbnb. They seem to be receptive to the arguments that we make. But why did the municipal government allow Uber to come in and essentially deregulate the vehicle for hire sector to roll out a way for them to do business in the city of Toronto with no resistance whatsoever? And I shouldn't say no resistance. There was a lot of conflict between taxis and Uber. And there were attempts to fight Uber's entrance into Toronto. There were legal proceedings that were withdrawn. There were the taxi industry that was organizing. But the conflict really evolved around an incumbent industry and the new shiny thing named Uber that everyone loved, that came to Toronto and offered innovation and new ways of getting around. And that didn't really work in the city of Toronto. This conflict between the incumbent industry and Uber didn't work. And we thought, well, why don't we organize it differently and create a broad-based coalition of academics, environmental organizations, workers that work on, that are represented by the ATU, that in the transit system, cyclists and pedestrians, essentially everyone that is impacted by the rise of vehicular traffic in the city of Toronto. And the idea from the very beginning was to not, let Uber steer this debate back to the taxis, but to really broaden the range of arguments that we can level to talk about congestion, to talk about emissions, to talk about the impact on transit, to talk about the impact on drivers' lives and their wages, to talk about cycling infrastructure, et cetera, and to build this broad coalition of organizations and academics, et cetera, to launch Ridefair Toronto and to give it another kick at the can to see if we can now figure out a way to rein this company back in. And that's all started pre-pandemic in 2019, shortly after, all hell broke loose and we had to really change our plans and the way we organize, and there was no more community meetings and all of that. But we continued on. And partially because, this is a number in 2014, the city had about 600 licensed taxi cabs. And that was about one cab for every 500 residents. And that was considered sufficient to service Torontonians alongside existing transit and other modes of transportation. Then, fast forward 2019, we had 129,000 licensed rideshare drivers in the city of Toronto, or one licensed rideshare driver per 23 residents. So, that was sort of the situation that we saw in 2019. And it brought us back to 2014 when city staff and council were actually looking at this question to determine like what's an appropriate number of taxi cabs in the city of Toronto to efficiently service Torontonians. And that report, the staff report, came to council, and it literally recommended that the city has opted to place a cap on the number of licensed taxi cabs rather than to allow an open entry market where there is no limit. And it was recognized that having too many taxi cabs negatively affects drivers' incomes, which can result in risky driving habits, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a clear recognition that, hey, we do need to figure out what's the balanced approach here. We can't have unlimited number of taxi drivers because they eat each other's lunch and no one can make a living. So what's an appropriate number? That was 2014. 2015, Uber comes to Toronto, starts operating illegally, and rolls out its, lobbying might and basically gets the city of Toronto to change course like 180 degrees. They managed to deregulate the entire industry, to legalize Uber in Toronto. They removed safety and training and emission requirements that already existed in the industry to lower the barriers for Uber to participate in the city or to offer services. And worst of all, they handed Uber significant powers over licensing of drivers. So the local government basically said, well, let's let the vendor determine how many cars they're supposed to be in the city of Toronto and let them do the permitting and let them do the licensing. And we wash our hands of it. Less work for us. Uber is going to do it for us. Perfect. That was all done under Mayor Tory, who loved, shiny new things and innovation, et cetera, et cetera. His staff was very much involved behind the scenes in making sure that the council votes will be such that Uber gets everything they want from their lobbying efforts. In 2022, there was I don't know if people remember the Uber leaks, 124,000 documents leaked to The Guardian that really detailed how Uber operated globally and worldwide in terms of creating government regulations that suits them, including some details about Toronto under Mayor Tory, basically reconfirming everything that critics have said: how the company operates, how the company lobbies, how they really bully their way around governments. And so it was no surprise to us that this has taken place under Tory, but it was a little bit surprise to us that, on the other hand, Tory was very amenable to regulating Airbnb and other platforms like it. And so we thought, let's try a different approach here. I think I already mentioned the sheer amount of growth, which obviously had an impact on, drivers' wages, but I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the first things we did is we looked at some of the city's own reporting and the Uber data to determine, like, what's the impact on transit in the city of Toronto, for example. And we saw that in Toronto, right when Uber arrived, we saw a dip in transit ridership, and we saw an uptake in Uber trips. And from cities reporting, we could basically figure out that Uber has substituted 31 million TTC trips in 2019 alone, which resulted in about 74 million of lost TTC fares, which is significant because the TTC is mostly fare funded and very much underfunded from other levels of government. So it's actually a huge chunk that's been taken out of the TTC because the city government fails to, regulate this vendor in a way that protects city services and good jobs that are provided by these city services. So that's one thing. So we really try to hone in on, like, so what's Uber's impact not only on the taxi industry, but what does it do to transit, for example? What does it do to congestion and emissions, et cetera, et cetera? I think one of the key things that we also found was and that really bugged us. I think it was maybe this year even, that Uber was running around and was claiming that their drivers make $34. If you could look a little closer, they actually said that Toronto drivers earned a median income of $34 per engaged hour. So, no one that I ever talked to talks about the median income of whatever for their engaged hour, right? Like this concept of engaged hour, everyone here knows what that means. But when you actually look at the data that Uber had to provide to the city and that the city published in their own reporting, we could see that about 48% of Uber drivers in the city of Toronto, or 48% of their time, is spent without a consumer, without a customer, without a rider in the seat. So, which means that out of the $34, if you subtract those 48%, it's $16, right, that they make. But then if you actually also take into consideration how much it costs to operate a vehicle, to lease a vehicle, to pay for fuel, to pay for insurance, to pay for wear and tear, et cetera, we actually reduced the number even more. And, we took Revenue Canada data on to come up with that number. And, it turned out that drivers were making something around $4 to $6. And the minimum wage just went up in Ontario is 17, right? So like imagine that you make $6. And we not just didn't make this. We didn't make it up. Like we actually talked to drivers, we work with drivers that organize, with the Rideshare Association of Ontario. And, so we don't go out and publish stuff thinking like, like we look at the data and this is what's happening. We actually talk to drivers, right? And the drivers also share their pay stubs with us. So, the pay stubs that we receive to sort of see what that means in real life were such that, we got 41 samples. And out of these 41 samples of weekly pay stubs, 10 drivers averaged less than minimum wage before expenses. Only one driver earned above minimum wage after expenses. I mean, you see it here. Like the average earnings after expenses were about, between $6.20 and $7.34. So it's not that we make these numbers up. They're actually reflected in the daily experience of these rideshare drivers, which explains why drivers repeatedly, I think it was in February during now what's the that special day in February when you give your partner flowers? Yeah. There was a global protest, thank you, organized by, I should know that, I guess, by rideshare drivers around the world to strike on Valentine's Day. And that happened also in Toronto. Part of it is because they make that little money. So we made significant progress in the city. We managed to reinstitute mandatory driver training. We initiated actions on missions. Most importantly, we initiated a cap on the drivers in October. That was temporarily imposed, but then rescinded after Uber sued the city successfully and really bullied the mayor through their ability to message tens of thousands of drivers and customers saying, your fare has just gone up because this mayor instituted an arbitrary cap. Anyways, I have a lot more to say here. Maybe I just end that Uber just introduced algorithmic prices, wages in October. That resulted in more protests at Pearson Airport. And we have just collected data on what that means for drivers. And we have compared how much money these drivers would have made if the old model based on rate cards, which is based on time and distance, would still apply, and how much they make now. And what this data has told us now is that they basically got a 20% pay cut on top of the tremendously low pay they're already getting. So, we will see a lot more of this happening in the city of Toronto, but there is an opportunity here in December for council to set things right and do things right. And we have hope that under this new mayor, Mayor Chow and her administration, that we are actually making some gains here and rein this company in to, make sure that we reduce the number of overall drivers, to reduce emissions, to reduce congestion, and to make sure that they spend more time being engaged, making actual money, which would, benefit a lot of people, but these companies that have instituted themselves as an essential monopoly in the city of Toronto. I'll leave it here, but I'd be happy to answer any questions down the road. Thanks.